So till now we did basic socket programming, right? We actually learned about the fact that how exactly we can set up a basic app server and prepare some socket connection so that the client and the server can communicate within each other. Now, in actual world, when you actually join, let's say a startup, or let's say you join a company, then you will realize one simple thing, that you don't have to build everything from scratch until or unless you are actually building kind of like a framework or something. Why? Because why you don't have to build everything from scratch? Because there are already tools, libraries and frameworks that are already available for your aid. Somebody in the community or somebody in your company and team must have already resolved all of that for you, and must have given you endpoints and APIs and functions and libraries to actually use directly, so that you can build product out of it. So it's not like the socket programming part that we learned was irrelevant. For example, I'll give you an example. So in Google, what happens is in the backend, there are absolutely different frameworks. So if you use Java, Python, C++, Golang, whatever frameworks you know about already. For example, in Python, there is a framework Django. In Java, there is very famous framework Spring Boot and everything. In Google internally, we don't use Django, Spring Boot and everything. We have our own internal Google frameworks on which we actually build our applications. Now, there are dedicated teams in Google who actually make that framework. So what happens if you actually land up a job in that particular team, right? In that kind of a case, you need to know the internals of all of these web architecture stuff and everything, right? For example, I can give an example of LinkedIn. For example, at LinkedIn, we used to use a framework named as RESTly. Okay. Now, RESTly is an open source framework and library altogether, but you will not find a lot of people who are writing Java code in the backend using RESTly. But somebody in the LinkedIn team actually contributed to RESTly, right? So that it is now usable across LinkedIn. So this is something that you have to understand, that knowing the internals of computer science, app development, backend development is very necessary, because you cannot expect always that you will land up a job in a product team which is just using those frameworks and building something out of it. I'll give you one more example. Now, a lot of people use Git, right? But don't know internals of Git. But let's say you land up a job at GitLab, or you land up a job at GitHub or Bitbucket, then you will be heavily relying on version control systems. In Google as well, we have our own version control system. So some team is actually building that, right? So always keep that thing in mind, that try to be hungry for the internals, try to be curious for the internals about the fact that how exactly something very specific is done. Now, coming to the fact that in the world of Node.js, if you want to build backend application, because Node.js actually helped you to do one simple thing, that is bring your JavaScript out of the browser and run it directly on your OS, right? On your OS level or on your terminal, you can directly run now JavaScript, right? So in the Node.js environment, what you have is, we have a bunch of frameworks that can help us write backend application very easily. Like, you have all of the details abstracted out, and you have just very bare minimum things that you have to do in order to set up your own backend server. And for that, the framework that we can actually use, so there are again a bunch of frameworks. The most famous framework is ExpressJS. It is very light, very minimalistic, right? Very unopinionated. That means it doesn't expect you to do something very specific in a particular way, right? There are other frameworks as well. For example, there is a framework called as Sales.js, right? So Sales.js is kind of like a adaptation for Ruby on Rails for Node.js, right? It is still like a lot of development is still going on, right? You can see it's in version 0 and version 1. So Sales.js was launched very recently, like 2012, you can see, right? And have been under constant development, right? What I have understood is that not a lot of, at least Indian startups, are migrating to Sales.js as of now, because still a lot of things are need to be figured out. But it's again a very interesting framework to actually learn. But what we are looking at is ExpressJS, right? You can see ExpressJS is slightly older, 2010. It was launched almost 1 year after Node.js was actually launched. It's a web application framework that is pretty robust, highly scalable as well. It is fast, it is unopinionated, it is minimalistic, right? That means fast means it is very fast in terms of the performance of overall optimization. Unopinionated means that it doesn't expect you to do something in a very specific way. You can modularize your whole application, you can structure your whole application in any way, whatever kind of a specificness you actually need, however you want to structure your code, you can actually do that. It is minimalist. That means it comes with bare minimum, bare bones packages. It doesn't comes with a lot of bulky packages. For example, if you go with a framework like Ruby on Rails, it, the moment you boot up a very basic application of Ruby on Rails also, then also a lot of functionality gets inbuilt to your project, right? Why that might not be necessary for you? Because maybe you want to just build a very small to-do app. You don't want functionalities like I would say real-time communication, emails and everything there. But Ruby on Rails will directly give you everything on the top of it. One disadvantage that I am able to think about Node.js is that it doesn't come with its own library to interact with databases. I believe that could have been a support that they could have given natively, right? So there are libraries that are available using which you can actually interact with database with other frameworks like Rails, Django and everything. But ExpressJS doesn't give that. But we have, of course, open source packages that we can actually use. And getting started with ExpressJS is absolutely extremely simple. You can go to the getting started tab and you can see a lot of details are already given. Every time you can just open this page and follow it blindly, no matter what. Okay, so you can see, first of all, it says you can prepare your app. So let's make a new folder, mkdir, and just a fun fact, they are most probably giving you instruction for a Linux machine. If you don't have a Linux machine, you have a Windows machine. So instead of mkdir for Windows, I'm not sure what it is. Oh, Windows also have mkdir. So great. So this is a common command that can work with both Windows and Linux and Mac. Everything will work. So you can do mkdir, and I can write, let's say, to do app. I'll make a very basic to do application and we will learn throughout this to do app a lot of things, right? So mkdir to do app. I'll say cd to do app. Okay. So you can see I'm inside the to do app folder. You can see you are expected to go inside the folder. Then you can execute the command npm init. What does npm init does is, in the current folder, whatever is your current folder, it actually initiates npm I would say functionalities. It actually starts preparing a package out of it. So if you do npm init, what happens is, if you have done front end already, then you might be already aware about package.json and everything. So it will try to prepare a basic package.json file so that you can actually manage the whole application. The moment you do npm init, it will give you a prompt, very basic prompt, that what do you want to name the package. If you want to name something else, you can write it. If you want to give the default one which is written here, just press enter. Version, just press enter. If you want to give a description, give a description, otherwise just press enter. Entry point index.js, if you want to change it, otherwise enter. Test command, just enter. Git repository, if you want to specifically link, you can link, otherwise just press enter. Enter, enter, enter. And after a few enters, you can just see that it mentions about to write to this particular folder a package.json file. So you can see it prepares a package.json file for you. Is this okay? Yes. So what is this package.json? Let me actually help you with that. So this package.json is one of the most important file inside your Node project. This package.json is kind of like a metadata for your whole project. We can discuss more about package.json in a few more sessions, but you can understand one simple thing about package.json. Package.json gives you some metadata about the project, that what is the project about, the description, name, what's the version of the project, and it will also contain any kind of dependencies. Like if you depend on a third party package, right? Or third application, let's say you want to depend on Axios. So there will be a dedicated part in which you will be mentioning all the dependencies, right? The moment you will do any kind of npm install, no, it will automatically mention a set of dependencies for you, right? That is the use case of package.json. So what will happen is, at any point of time, if somebody wants to use this project, all they have to do is just clone this project, run npm install, and after running npm install, what will happen is npm install will automatically parse this package.json, get all of the metadata. In that metadata, it will get the list of dependencies and it will automatically install the packages. For example, let's start with our first package, ExpressJS. So you can see it gives you a command, npm install express. You copy, paste, press enter. The moment you do that, can you see there is now a dependencies property express. And can you see the moment we installed it, a new node module folder has been initiated. Now, even if I delete it, if let's say I delete it, okay, and now I do npm install, just npm install, npm I, you can see it will again install the whole node modules folder. How? Because it will parse the package.json and get the list of dependencies that it needs to install. Now, the moment you do npm install of any particular file, you will also get a file package-lock.json. Now, what is the use case of package-lock.json? So in a simple term, you can actually understand that. For example, you installed Express, right? Now, Express is a very, it's a minimalistic framework, but it is still very big. There's a lot of code inside ExpressJS. And that piece of code depends on some other third-party packages. It's kind of like a dependency resolution that I talked about, right? That one package that you want to install internally depends on something else. For example, if you see package-lock.json, right? So you can see there are a lot of node modules that are mentioned actually here. Encode, URL, Express. Now, if you go to Express, if you see package-lock.json, do you see it lists the dependencies of Express? Like Express also depends on a bunch of packages. You have to install them also, right? For example, there is a package Body Parser that Express depends on. So if you scroll down, if you will scroll down a bit, you can see it has installed Body Parser as well. And if you open node modules, you can see there is a folder of Express and all the dependencies of Express. For example, one dependency was Body Parser. You can see there is a whole installation of Body Parser that has been done. So it is the duty of npm to do all the dependency resolution. So it will read what your app depends on, and internally these libraries, what do they depend on, right? Everything will be sorted out by your npm. See, as simple as that. And all the installation is done. So you can see installing step is done. So it's very easy to set it up. Just create the folder, go inside the folder, do npm init, do npm install, and that's it, right? Now we know how to set up a basic npm project and install Express in it. Now you can see if you go to the documentation next hello world, it gives you a very basic set of code to actually run up your whole application. Okay, before I explain you anything, I'll just copy paste everything, okay, and create a new file. So let's say here you can create a new file index.js, paste everything. Please don't put a lot of brain that what is actually going on here and there. Let's just copy paste everything as it is. And then you have to execute this command node app.js, right? So if you are having VS Code, you can, and you have an extension. So there is an extension called as code runner, right? So you can install this extension. If you already have that extension installed, what will happen is you will see a play button here. You can run that play button and you can see an application has been started. If you don't want to use that play button, then in the terminal you can do node and name of the file that you just wrote index.js. What is this file? What is it all about? I'll tell you. But you can see we have some log that came up and the terminal is blocked. It's not exiting, right? And we have seen similar behavior previously as well. But let me throw some more light on what's actually going on. So I'll now delete the whole thing altogether and let's start writing everything from scratch. Okay, cool. So first things first, right? What you have to do is you have installed Express, right? If you have worked with environments like React or anything, or if you have ever worked with any other kind of a coding project, when you install a library, what do you have to do? You have to actually import it, right? You have to actually import that library in order to use it. Okay. Now, how can we import ExpressJS? So you might have seen a syntax like this: import X from Y. You might have seen syntax like this, right? Import X from Y, right? This kind of a syntax is called as a ES module syntax or ECMAScript module syntax, right? Some frameworks by default support this kind of a syntax. For example, React. If you install a React project, it will by default support a syntax like this. It is properly configurable as well. Other projects can also, who are not by default supporting this syntax, can start supporting the syntax, right? Otherwise, there are some frameworks that have supports something called as a common JS moduling, right? In common JS moduling, for example, Express out of the box supports common JS moduling. If you want to import something, it is more of a bit more easy syntax. You say const, you can say let also, where also. Why do I am writing const? Is because if we are importing a library, then we are not going to change this reference of this object anywhere. So it's good to keep it as a const, right? Is equals to require, and then as a string you can mention express. Require is going to do the same thing. It's going to import the library express. And when you import the library express, what happens is it returns you something. It actually returns you a function. You can actually hover here and actually read. So you can see express, this word express that we have got is a function. It's a top level function exported by the express module. So this express module has actually returned you a function, right? Okay. Now what is the use of this function? What is the use of this function? Using this function, so I will write it here actually. We got access to express function. Okay. What will happen is if you invoke this function, if you invoke express, what happens is it returns you a app object. You can hover on it. It creates an express application. So this app object that you have got, app is a new express application object, right? It's a new express application object. Now you can understand one thing with this. This call has now abstracted everything for you. This app object is going to do everything for you. That is, let's say, what were you doing with your socket programming part? You were actually creating a socket object, then you were binding it to your local host and a port, then you were expecting some connection request to actually happen, so on and so on. A lot of things you were doing, right? Technically, all of those things are actually going to go behind the scenes here, and everything this app object will automatically handle. Creation of new socket connections, new socket objects, using the thread pool for concurrent connections, everything it is going to do. All you have to do is two things. First, using the app object, bind it to a port you want your server to listen for socket connections. Okay, so we will be listening to a particular port, right? And that port is configurable. Right? So Express allows you to do that. Express say that, okay, you can configure your own port altogether, right? So how do you do that? You can say app.listen. Remember, we already had a similar listen kind of a method inside our Python app. So if I go to the Python app that we actually created, right? Socket programming. If you go to server.py, if you remember, we had a similar listen kind of a feature, right? That it started listening for incoming connection request. Similar app.listen method we have here as well. There are two parameters to the listen method. The listen method takes two parameters. First is the port number. Second is a callback. Okay. Now port number is something normal that you can understand, that let's say we'll go to port 3000. Okay. Now what is this callback? So it takes a callback with itself, right? This callback is executed once we successfully bind our object to the port and start listening to a new connection. Okay, so once you successfully bind to a port and start listening for a new connection, once both of these two steps happens, then as an indicator, this callback is executed. So inside this callback, if you want to do something, you can do it. For example, I am just going to log server started at port 3000. Okay. Now you might be thinking, okay, sir, is it just for logging purpose, or do you want to, or is it actually having some use case? So it has multiple use cases. For example, let's say when you boot up your server, you want to connect to a database, right? Because database connection will be required for, let's say, any database interaction, right? That connection also happens over TCP. So if you want to do that connection, you want to do it once your app server has successfully started. If your app server has not started, who will connect to the database, right? No one. So once your app server has started, then post that you want to do something, this is the right place to do. For example, making a database connection, right? So currently we are not connected to any database because it's just the start. So I'm keeping it as it is, right? And you can see we have a basics app ready. If I now execute this code, so if I do node index.js, you will see a similar thing happening. You can see there is a log coming up. This log denotes that your server successfully connected to port, and now it is waiting. And do you remember, in a similar way our application was waiting when we wrote that Python socket or the node socket, because now it is waiting for connection requests. It's waiting for incoming connections to actually happen, right? All of that abstracted out. You don't have to care about anything. Okay, so I'll just write one more pointer here. This callback is useful to do any action post the server is created. Example db connection. Okay, example db connection. Cool. Now let's say this is good, right? Now let's say you want to see, okay, can we connect to this app, right? Previously, to connect to the application, if you remember, we wrote a specific Python client also, right? Because on the client side also we need to create a socket and connect to the given port and then start sending data and receiving data, right? But in actual world, you don't have to do all of these things. Browser, if you're doing any browser coding, then all of the libraries and everything will automatically do that. Otherwise, to test your backend application, you have a software called as Postman. If you don't have Postman downloaded, you can actually download it from its official website. It's a very simple application altogether, right? Um, Let me sign into Postman once. I believe it will require me sign in. No, just a second. Let me sign into Postman very quickly. Just a minute, guys. Okay, yep. Okay, cool. Um, can just close all of this. Don't save or just a second. Okay, so this is a basic Postman setup, right? If you will open Postman and log in, then you will realize that this kind of a setup is there. Somewhere in your on your screen, you will find kind of like this plus button. You can click on this plus button and you will get an interface like this. Okay, this interface is very simple to understand. This is where you put the URL, most probably the URL of your server, right? For our server, what is the URL? It is currently working on my machine and I have not exposed it to the internet. So only my own machine can communicate to it. So that means the address is localhost, or in IP, you can say 127.0.0.1. And the port number is 3000, right? So port 3000. And then we can start making requests to it. Okay. So something like localhost 3000. Okay. But if you currently make a request, so you can see the server is up. If you currently make a request, send, you can see you get an error. 404 not found. You get a 404 not found. Okay. If you turn off the server and now you send the request, now you can see it cannot connect. So are you able to understand? There is difference in both of the error that happened. Currently my server is not running, so it was not even able to connect to the server, right? That means no socket connection actually happened, right? But if the server is up, then it doesn't say that we were not able to connect. Instead, it says that something was not found. Something that you were trying to access was not found. Now, what is not found? Now, whenever you actually try to connect to your backend, right, you need to mention some kind of a route. Now that route, what is the route? Route will be some address that you are going to mention. Let's say post your socket string. So this is the socket string. Your address and the port is your socket string. So after the socket string, let's say you do something like slash ping. Now this slash ping is your route. If you don't put anything, then your route is just the slash. Your route is just the slash, or slash home you can define. So these are your routes. So these are actually like I would say unique strings that you can mention, and you have to define them on your backend. That okay, if somebody sets up a connection with our app server, that is good, but what to do? So for every route you are going to define a specific action, that okay, if somebody accessed slash home, we are going to send them some data. If somebody accessed slash ping, we are going to send them some data, right? This is what you are going to configure. And then for every request, there will be type of request. These are the type of HTTP request. So you can make a get request, post request, put, patch, delete, these kind of requests. We'll talk more about it, right? But for the timing, if you try to, let's say, access localhost 3000 slash ping and send, you can see we get 404 not found. Why you get 404 not found? Because on the back end, we have not defined what to do in case somebody access slash ping, right? That is something that we should define. So how can we define that? It is very easy. So above your app.listen, above the part where you have actually started your app server, I'll do two things. First of all, to make this port more configurable, I'll extract it out in a variable and then use it as a variable. You can hard code it, but again, a good practice will be to use a variable. And then now let's define some routes. How do you define a route? To define the route also, you can use this app object. You can say app dot. Then you have to mention the type of the HTTP request, whether you want to make a get request or you want to make a post request or you might want to make a patch request, what kind of request you want to make. Let's say I want to make a get request. So in small letters, you write get and you put a pair of parentheses. Okay. Now this method takes two arguments. One is route as a string and second is a callback. Okay, so let's give the route. So let's say we'll give a route slash ping. So now I'm trying to define what should happen if somebody tries to hit localhost 3000 slash ping with a get request. What should happen? So if we receive this request, what will happen is we are going to execute a callback. Can you see I wrote a callback? Okay, this is the callback executed. So if somebody hits localhost 3000 slash ping from this machine, we will execute this callback. Okay, we will execute this callback. Okay, cool. So let's say I'll do console.log ping received. Okay, let's try now. So let's restart. Now the file has been changed, index.js has been changed. So I'll restart. So if you restart and now if you try to hit, can you see now you're not getting an error? What's happening is your request is stalled. Stalled means it's in a waiting state. It's expecting some response. And if you see, we have logged ping received. Can you see we have logged ping received? Okay. If I cancel the request and send it again, you can see ping received again, right? So we are able to now receive a request on the backend. But this client side, this postman is technically our client. This is not able to receive any response. Why? Because I have not sent any response. I have just printed a string. Now, how do you send a response back? Now, this callback accepts two parameters, request, response. Okay. Request, response. Okay. Now you might be thinking, oh, sir, who is passing this callback? Oh, sorry, who is passing both of these parameters? First thing, this is basic JavaScript programming. Now, because this is a callback, it will be executed when somebody hits slash ping. Now, where is the logic of its execution written? It will be written inside the Express framework. So inside the Express framework, what must be happening is It's kind of like a, let's say, a function, right? F that is expecting a callback, and after some logic, it will automatically call this callback with a parameter of a request and response object. This implementation is already written inside Express. What we have to do is we have to just pass this callback, that what we are going to call actually, right? Same thing here. We have to just pass a callback. Who will call this callback? This app object inside this, the whole Express coding which has been done, will automatically call this callback and will pass a request and a response object. This request object is the same object that we are actually sending from here. This is the same request object, request HTTP object that we are going to send from here. And this is the same response object that will be received on the client side. So we can actually read parameters from the request object and configure our response object to send something. Okay. So request object contains detail about incoming request. Now you might be thinking details like what? Details like query params, body params, and so on, right? What is query params and body params? So if you want to send the data from client to the server, there are certain ways in which you can actually send the data. Those are URL params, query params, and body params. I'll come to that. But you can say all of that incoming data will be inside this request object. I'll show you how you can access it. And the response object contains details about what response will be sent back to the client. Okay, what response will be sent back to the client. Okay, cool. So let's say, let's configure our response. We'll tackle our request object as well, but for the timing, let's configure our response. So I'll say, so the response object has a lot of methods. So I'll say response dot, let's say JSON. So if you want to send a JSON, what happens is you can call response.json. Okay. And you can pass a JavaScript object, and this JavaScript object will be sent as a JSON to the response. So I will say message ping received. Save it. Let's restart the server. Okay. Now, if you send a request of ping, you can see message received. Every time you try to ping, it is actually pinging the server. And you can see ping received, ping received, ping received. All of that is actually working. So now what we have done is we actually configured a response object altogether, which is actually sending some data to our client. So I'll just quickly push this much code to a new GitHub repo so that you have access to that. Added basic Express setup. Okay, let's create a new repo. Sorry, new repository. Express intro to do app. We'll add the remote. I'll check out master and I'll push to master. Okay, one mistake I guess I made. Okay, cool. Now you can see I have pushed everything to the master. Now there is one small problem that we have actually encountered. You can see I have by mistake pushed node modules as well, right? Technically we should not do that, because let's say if somebody installs all of this in a Windows machine or some other operating system, then having dependencies installed for Mac can actually create problems for them, and this actually makes the whole project a bit bulky as well. So I'd like to, because I want a fresh start altogether, I'll just quickly delete this repository, right? And I'll tell you how can you actually handle it. So in case if you want to make sure that any particular file or a folder is not accessible to Git, right? Then what you can actually do is you can create a new file dot git ignore, right? Inside this file you can actually mention everything, that what files or folders you want to be not tracked by git. So now inside the git ignore, now you can see what will you do is, let's say you want to hide a file, hide the whole folder of node modules from git. So you can just write node modules slash. Now what will happen is, if I do git init, if I do git status, oh sorry, first of all, let me delete the whole git project. Now let's do a git init. If I do a git status, now can you see we are not able to see node modules, right? The moment I remove this entry from dot git ignore and do a git status, can you see we have node modules back. So if you want to hide a folder or a file, anything, you just mention that in dot git ignore and it will be a good to go for you. So do git status, looks good. Now simple thing, git add, git commit, git checkout. Okay. Express intro to do app. We'll add the remote and git push. Here we go. You can see now there is no node modules folder coming up. You can see a very basic ExpressJS application is present. Now I would like to add a readme file here. So if you want to set up, right, to set up the project, all you have to do is, first of all, you have to clone the repo, git clone, then cd to express intro to do app. That is going to make sure that you actually go inside the corresponding folder. Then you do a npm install, and then you do a, for the time being, node index.js. Okay, so let's see how does it look like. Yep, these are the 4 steps. So I'll just define the steps. What do they actually do? First, clone the project. Second, move in the directory where project is coded and cloned. Install dependencies. And fourth, turn up the server. Save it, and I'll push this one as well. Git add all, git commit with readme, git push. And now you can see we have some basic steps. So it's very easy to start setting up a basic Express app. If you already have that on GitHub, somebody has prepared it for you. It is going to be quite simple to actually set things up, right? Pretty simple to move forward with. Now let's say that if the client has to send some data to us, how can it actually send the data? Okay, so technically speaking, there are 3 ways in which the client can actually send us some data. So this client can send us some data using URL params. It can send us the data on the backend using query params, or it can send the data using body params. Now what are all of these? Let's talk about it. URL params, as the name suggests, that this data is somehow somewhat embedded in the URL only. For example, if let's say the route that you are targeting is something like /products/1 or /products/2. Now you can see inside the URL only you are configuring that, okay, there is kind of like some product ID that you are sending. So on the back end, we can actually configure our routes, the route configuration that we did here. We can configure our routes such that it will expect that, okay, it will kind of like read a regular expression, or it will kind of like read the pattern of the incoming route and see that, okay, anything after /product/ is kind of like a variable value. It can change. It's a data value that we have to maybe consume. This is one way in which the client can send us some data. So you can have something like let's say slash user slash 2 slash product slash, or you have something like slash categories slash electronics slash product slash 2, something like this. So you can say the name of the category, that is electronics, is coming inside the URL params, right? So this is what URL params is. Apart from that, you have something called as a query param. What is a query param? In query param, if you have ever seen like applications like Flipkart or Amazon, let's say if I open flipkart.com, let's say I go to mobiles. Now, can you see inside the URL there is a question mark coming up, and after the question mark there is a key equals to a value, and a key equals to a value, and so on. So a lot of time in, let's say, your routes, for example, something like this will be there: products, okay, then a question mark. Then after question mark you can actually pass key value pairs. Key value pairs like, let's say, um, rating is equals to 4, right? So here the key is rating and the value is 4, okay, and minimum underscore price is equals to 30. So here, apart from this key value pair, you are passing one more key value pair, that minimum price should be 30 and max price is equals to 100. So again, after and you have a key value pair. So and separated or ampersand separated, you send a key value pair where every key and a value is differentiated by a equals to. To the left of equals to you have the key like rating, and to the right of it you have the value like 4. And all of this is after a question mark. So this is called as a query param, right? In this query param, you have not actually embedded kind of like a regex inside the route, but after the route you give a specific part of a kind of like a key value pair based scenario, where these scenarios are generally used. Let's say if you want to build up some filter like functionality, query params are a good way to go for, right? Cool. Now the only problem with these two kind of data sending or mechanisms is that both of these can be actually saved in the browser history, or can be like saved in the browser, because generally if you see the browser history, whatever is your URL is actually saved in the browser history, right? So in this kind of a case, what happens is if you want to send some sensitive data, for example some password or some secret token or something, you cannot send that in the URL params, otherwise it will be kind of like available in the browser history. To avoid that, we have third kind of I would say data sending capability called as body params. These body params are not visible in the URL. Instead, whatever is the incoming HTTP request, every HTTP request has a lot of parameters. For example, if you actually inspect, go to network, and you take a look at any HTTP request, for example, this one, okay, you can see it's an HTTP request. So every HTTP request has a lot of things. It will be having a HTTP request URL, HTTP request method, a status code, right? Remote address, a bunch of headers will be there. You can see accept on, control origin, content length, date. A lot of, I would say, data is actually sent in the request object. Along with this data, there is one more part of the data called as request body, right? So along with the headers, URL, status and everything, there is a request body as well. In this request body, you can also send some data. You can send a data like a text, you can send a data like a JSON, multiple things you can actually do. So this is the third way in which you can actually send the data inside your backend or to your backend, which will be accessible. And technically, if you look at Postman actually helps you to send all of these kind of data. For example, let's say if you want to send a URL param, you can just send a URL param like this. If you want to send a query param, you can put a question mark, and you can see in the params property with the query params, you can see some configuration is coming up. So let's say key equals to value we did. So it will automatically populate that what is the key and what is the value. Then after and if I do minimum price equals to 10, so you can see one more key value pair it actually established. So you can actually use Postman to configure your URL params, query params, and even the body params. You can see there is a body parameter, right? You can have a raw body, like you can just send a text, you can even send JavaScript, JSON, you can send an HTML or an XML. If you want to send some binary config, then you can select a file, send binary, right? If you want to send some form URL encoded data, you can actually set that. So if you want to check what is for example, if you want to check what is form URL encoded, okay, you can take a look here. What is the difference between form data and form URL encoded and raw in Postman. Okay, so let's take a look there. So in form data, the data represents the data sent from a website form to APIs as a part of a multi-part form data. So for example, if there is a website and let's say you have a form, inside that form you actually upload a file, right? That is kind of like called as a multi-part request, right? So whenever you have a form data incoming, like if you see here, form data, this will be actually considered kind of like a multi-part request, kind of like it will expect that generally multi-part request or form data request is sent for having file attachment in your request body, right? So you can see whenever you have, this can also be used for attaching files to the keys as well. So the form data option in Postman simulates filling out a form on a website. So when you actually send data in the form of form data property, you can see this option you select, it will actually mimic that you have actually sent the data from a website form, HTML forms you have. Then you have URL form, www form URL encoded. The URL encoded data sends encoded data to the server and uses same encoding as that of URL parameters, right? To use it, we need to select this particular tab in the body of the request. We need to enter the key value pairs for sending request body and Postman will encode it. Note that it cannot be used for encoding files, so we need to do it manually ourselves, right? However, it can encode the request body, right? This is also known as the default content type. All forms submitted with this content type follow the below encoding pattern. So you can say that whenever you use form URL encoded, then it will actually always send the data in a particular encoded format. Whereas if you send the raw, it will just send raw strings. Like if you send a text, it will send a raw text. If you send a JSON, it will send you a raw JSON altogether. So you can see Postman actually supports different type of, you can say, request body, I would say values. Whatever you want to use, you can use based on your use case. So just to revise, there are different ways to actually send your body params. This body means the body params from Postman, right? If you use form data, this actually mimics that. If you have, let's say, filled a web form on a website, it is going to actually mimic something similar to that. Then there is URL encoded form data. URL encoded form data is going to encode all of the key value pairs that you're going to send in the body params. URL encoded, like you can actually check for a URL encoded string. Like if you have never seen a URL encoded string, let me actually show you, right? So let's go to URL encoding decoding. So let's say if you have a URL like https colon / www.google.com, and then let's say you have something like question mark test is equals to 78 comma 93. Okay, let's say you have a string like this. If you click on encode, can you see this string has been changed a bit? Now all the special characters has been encoded now, right? They have been encoded to a particular UTF-8 character, right? Like you do not just directly send this comma. Instead of comma, you are sending %2c. So this is URL encoded string. So when you send, instead of normal form data, you send URL encoded form data. If there will be any special character, they will be actually URL encoded, right? So you can read about it. URL encoding, also known as person encoding, is a way to encode characters in a URL in a safe format, right? Apart from that, there is raw format as well. Like if you have a raw normal text or a plain JSON, like you have a JSON, you want to just send that JSON. If that kind of a configuration you want, then you can select raw here. So you have multiple options to send in the raw format. So now let's say that we have kind of like a bunch of query params coming in. So let's say with request, I'll send some query params and you want to access those query params here. How can you do that? Now, because these query params are going to be sent to us in the request, right? It makes sense to look out for them in the request object of this callback. That once somebody hits /ping, we can actually come to the we will actually come to this callback. Inside this callback, we have the access to the incoming request object and the response that we are going to send. So this request object is something that we can actually look for. So you can say console.log request.query. Okay, so there is a property called as request.query. Let's try to console it and see if we are able to receive it or not. I'll restart the server manually. And if I send the request again, you can see I got ping received. That means request has been successful. And now you can see we are accessing a JavaScript object. You can see. So this request.query is a JavaScript object, and inside this JavaScript object we have access to all of our key value pairs that were sent to us in the query params. How cool is that? See, this whole set of key value pairs is actually available in front of us. All you have to do is just do request.query. Now, in the similar way, how we access request query, let's try to access request body. Actually, it is going to give us some weird results. Let's say if I send a form data, let's say name Sanket, right? And let's say company Google. Okay, something like this if I try to send. Okay, if I send it, you can see currently we just are receiving request.query, right? So to access request body, you can do something like request.body. Okay, but will we be able to access request body? Let's see. Let's save the file, run the file, and let's raise the request again. If you will carefully see, we are still getting request query, but in the body we are getting undefined. That's a bit odd, right? Because if you will see ExpressJS documentation, to access the request body, you have to use the request object and the body parameter. I believe you can very easily find that on the documentation as well, right? Um, let's see, body. Okay, so you can see request.body, right? So there is something very interesting that is going on, right? I would highly recommend you guys to pause yourself here and try to read this particular part of the article. This will help you to understand a bunch of things that is happening, because this is very specific to request body that we are getting undefined here. So now if you carefully read this article, it says that request body contains key value pair of the data submitted in the request body. By default, it is undefined. So whatever output we are getting here is the expected output. No problem there at all. And is populated when you use body parsing middleware such as body parser and multer. Okay, so what is middleware? I'll talk about that. So for the timing, you can understand that there is something called as a body parser, or maybe you can use something like multer, using which you will be able to access what is actually populated. As request body shape is based on user controlled input, like you can see that, right? Request body can be something like a text, JSON, anything, right? URL form encoded data, normal form data. It can be something that will be controlled by the user. All property and values in this object are untrusted and should be validated before trusting, right? For example, request.body.foo.toString may fail in multiple ways. For example, foo may not be there or may not be a string, and toString might not be a function. So what they are signaling is that don't always trust the request body and the value that is coming up, right? It might not be what you expect. So try to validate as much as possible. So we'll talk about this validation separately. We'll be setting up a whole validation layer altogether in our projects. But first of all, if you want to access request body using body parser, you can see this is a small example that is given in front of you, right? You can see we are requiring body parser and trying to use it. How about you try to read this code and see what it is actually doing? So now technically what do we have to do is there is a package body parser, and this body parser actually comes already installed with Express. If you actually look at package-lock.json and you actually see the dependencies for Express, right? You'll see body parser already incoming, right? So you can actually use it. So how do we use it? We first of all require this body parser is equals to require body parser. Okay, so what body parser actually helps Express to do is it actually helps to read the body incoming body data object and try to parse it in the form of corresponding JSON. Okay, in order to use it, you have to use a syntax like app.use, app.use. It's a middleware based syntax. If you don't understand middleware, don't worry, you will eventually understand it in a moment. But we are using these two syntaxes, app.use and app.use. And inside app.use, first of all, you are passing bodyParser.json. When you call bodyParser.json, what bodyParser starts doing it whenever there is an incoming request object coming up and the type of the incoming request body is JSON, it starts parsing that JSON successfully. Then you have to do bodyParser.urlEncoded and pass a parameter extended true for incoming URL encoded form data. So in case you send a JSON or you send a form data or a URL encoded form data, for that, this is the line number 2. So the first line says that whenever any request is going to be handled by the Express app object, you can see this app object, then inside that request, body parser will be parsing the incoming request body if it is a JSON or it's a URL encoded incoming request body. So, because we saw that right here, that in the raw request you can send like text or let's say raw JSON, right? Or you can send URL and URL form encoded data as well. In fact, let's say if you send, let's say normal text, let's say a test string, okay, test string, okay, let's say you send this in the body, right, and you send the request, you can see still you are getting undefined. Why? Because currently nothing is getting parsed altogether. But now what will happen is we'll be starting to parse JSON and URL encoded string. So I'll copy this code directly from here, and always make sure before your in requests and the routes, you put it above on the top. Okay, on the top you put, and we'll restart the server. So let's change the spelling of body parser. I'll restart the server node index.js, and now if let's say we first of all try to send the form data, if I send it, now you can see we are getting empty object. This is strange. But let's say if we try to send URL encoded form data, name Sanket, and send it. Now you can see we are getting the data, because I mentioned, right, that when you do body parser.url encoded, then whenever you will be getting a URL encoded form data, that will be read by body parser. If let's say you send a raw string, now let's say try to send a raw string, send it. You see, it is not even able to still read any raw string, but it doesn't give undefined. But the moment instead of a raw string text, you start sending a JSON, let's say in the JSON I send name Sanket Singh and send it. Now you can see Sanket Singh is getting read. Why? Because you configured that now I'm going to only read any incoming JSON or any incoming URL encoded data, right? So you can read more about body parser. You can read more about body parser, right? That what all things it actually supports, right? So let's say if you want to use the raw text body parser, right? So you can see you can do body parser.text. So for example, let's say we try to start to use body parser.text, save it and restart. Now let's say if we try to send a text Sanket and send it, you can see now it starts reading text, right? So whatever you will configure that, okay, I want to read JSON, I want to read URL encoded data, I want to read text, whatever you are going to configure, it is going to start reading that. How cool is that? And now inside request body, you have access to all of those corresponding parameters. Okay, so I'll still commit all of this so that you guys have access to the code as the reference. Git commit -m added body parser configurations, git push. Here we go. Now we actually saw that how can you actually interact with let's say query params and body params. What about URL params? So URL params, as the name suggests, you have to actually configure your route URL such that the params are actually accessible. For example, let's say I try to access one more route. Just, I guess this is properly guessable. If currently it's a get request, you put app.get. If you want to make a post request, you do app.post. Okay. So let's say I make a post request on /ping. And let's say I want to send some data on URL params. So let's do something like this. Let's say we do categories, right? Now, after categories, I want to put, let's say, the name of the category. Let's say something like electronics. Then I want to put the put /products, and then I want to put some product ID, let's say 8. Now you can see inside this URL, this part is variable because currently I want electronics, sometimes I might want kitchenware, sometimes I want, let's say, clothing, something like that. So this is a variable part. And product ID, currently I want product ID 8, maybe let's say I want some other product ID, something like that, right? So this is what we want to configure. So let's say request response. Okay, so inside URL params, as I mentioned, that you actually configure your URL or the routes such that they actually prepare a pattern that, okay, if this kind of a pattern of a URL actually comes up, we are going to hit this particular callback. So now how do you define that I would say pattern. So whatever is the variable part of your URL, right? For example, this electronics is a variable part because this can be electronics, this can be kitchenware, this can be changed by the user. So what you do is you put it like colon category. So you put it like colon category. Here you have, let's say 8. So let's say you put like colon ID. So what happens is at any point of time inside your URL, when Express actually parses colon, it automatically assumes that, okay, this part of the URL is a variable part. The values will be configurable by the user who is going to make the request. Same thing here, colon ID configurable. And then if you want to access these, for example, if I just say response is this, but if I want to access these, you can do request dot. Now you have an access to params, request dot params. If I save it, restart, and let's say I want to make a request to this particular URL. So this, now here the ID is, let's say 8, and let's say the category is electronics, and let's say it's a post request. If I send it, you can see ping received coming up here. And now you can see we are again able to access an object, right? Sorry, my bad, I sent it colon 8. We should just send 8. Now you can see that we are getting an object inside which there are two keys, category and ID. These keys are same as the colon value that we mentioned here. If you change the colon value here, for example, change ID to product underscore ID, something like this, save it, restart, then you will realize that we have started receiving product underscore ID. So whatever you will put after colon, that will be kept as the key, and then whatever is sent by the user in this particular part of the URL is going to be accessed as the value. So you will again get access to a key value pair based object. And that's how you can access any of these three: URL params, query params, and body params. So I'll commit this one as well. Added URL params example. Here we go. Now inside the HTTP request, you will see that there is a part of a headers as well. So you can see in this post request, you can see there is a part of a header, right? There are 9 hidden headers that are automatically configured by Postman, right? These are auto-generated headers, and you can send some custom headers as well. For example, let's say you can send a header like x-access-token, and let's say you can set up a random token like this. Okay. Now, how can we access these headers? So in the similar way, how we are able to access params, body, and query, there is a property called as request.headers. If you save it and you restart your server and send it. Now can you see we are able to access the whole headers object, and inside this headers object, we have access to the x-access token, that is the custom configured header that we have configured, and you can see the remaining incoming header object key value pairs that were pre-configured by Postman is also coming up, right? So you can see accessing headers is also kind of like a cakewalk for us. So most of the things you can see are pretty much self explanatory. Request.headers helps you to access the incoming headers in the HTTP request object. Request.params helps you to access the URL params coming in the URL. Request.body helps you to access the body params coming in the HTTP request. Request.query helps you to access custom query parameters that is coming in the URL. Now, one thing that you have to carefully understand between query params and URL params is that query params are not already prior defined. They can come at runtime and they can come in any shape in the runtime. It's just that there will be key value pair. What will be the key, what will be the value will be decided at runtime. Whereas in URL params, this is kind of like a strict contract that, okay, there will be a category property which will be variable and a product ID property which will be variable. This is something that you should always keep in mind.